Good morning. This hearing will come to order. We're pleased to welcome you to FSGG Member Day. The appropriations process benefits tremendously from engagement and input from members of Congress. They represent a wide array of districts and citizens who are impacted by the important issue covered in this bill. The testimonies help us understand the best ways to serve our constituents and the country. With that, I welcome the members to our subcommittee and look forward to your input. Mr. Visklowski from Indiana is recognized. You're new at this, I know.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gray, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I also appreciate the opportunity for other members to testify to open up the committee to the general membership. I am here first and foremost to thank you for your actions in fiscal year 20 in providing $4 million for Public Law 115-426, the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act, as well as fighting hard to retain $2 million for this law in conference. I am here today to again request $4 million in funding for this act. The request is in line with prior Congressional Budget Office estimates of the proper funding needed to implement the law. As you know, the act requires the National Archives and Records Administration to establish a collection of government records relating to cold cases from the civil rights era. Additionally, the public law establishes a review board to facilitate the review of these cases, a transmission of documents, and the determination of public disclosure. In justifying the request, I would like to highlight that since the passage of the Emmett Till Act of 2007, the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have investigated over 100 lynching-related cases, but have successfully prosecuted only one. Specifically, most of the participants and witnesses of these cases are now deceased, which leaves the agencies to rule most cases closed. Because successful prosecution is primarily unavailable, we must focus our concerns on helping families achieve a measure of closure, even if the full justice they deserve is no longer available. So again, appreciate the time you have availed of me, appreciate your help for this year, and we'll continue to look forward to working with your staff, say, in 21.
Is it, answer a question if possible. Have the Justice Department said how long they anticipate this process will go?
Is it 5 or 10 years?
It should be a 10-year. It's the congressional budget. It's 5 years.
5 years.
CEO estimate 5 years.
So it's a 5-year from here on?
That is our Senate, yes.
Okay. Mr. Graves, you have any questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Graves, proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate I appreciate the opportunity to join you this morning. I just wanted to raise.
You could, just for the record, identify yourself.
Sure. Garrett Graves from South Louisiana.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to join you this morning, and just wanted to raise an issue that has been highlighted within the past couple of years as a result of all the disasters that we've had across the United States. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, the Small Business Administration is one of the few sources of assistance that is immediately available, and they provide disaster loans to individuals as well as to businesses. They make those loans available, which is a fantastic resource and opportunity, because I'll say it again, in many cases, those resources are scarce in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So if someone wants to be proactive, wants to come back and recover their community, it's one of the only funding sources that's available. And so they offer low-interest loans to individuals, homeowners, renters, and to business owners. But what happens is that we have a separate agency, a separate appropriations through HUD, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Under that program, Congress may or may not provide the funds. We may do it within weeks. We may do it within years. Those funds ultimately become available as a grant to disaster victims. So on the one hand, you have a loan available from SBA that is available immediately. On the other hand, you may or may not have a grant available through a HUD-funded program to disaster victims. Under the wisdom of Congress, we have, and I think some flawed interpretation from FEMA and others, we have told disaster victims that if you get a loan, you are ineligible for a grant. Now, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, think about the incentive that we're providing here. We're basically telling disaster victims, effectively, sit back and wait and see if grants become available. Because if you get a loan, you're not going to be able to get a grant. Now, I'm going to ask everyone in this room, if you were given the option, would you prefer a grant that you don't have to pay back, or a loan that you do on top of all the other impacts you're experiencing from a disaster? I'm going to guess you would all choose the grant option. So we did step in, and I want to thank you for helping us on this in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, Section 1210, Section 1210A of that law. We did clarify that a loan and a grant should not be considered duplicative of one another. I'll say it again. Without changing this policy, what we do is we incentivize people to sit back in a FEMA-supplied hotel room or in a FEMA-supplied trailer that, by the way, cost about $150,000 a pop when you can buy them at the local trailer dealer for about $28,000. So it makes no sense for taxpayers to do this. So we went ahead and changed the law. It took HUD over 1 year to write the guidance, and they totally screwed it up. There's no, I'm not going to mince words, they totally screwed it up. And so right now, this committee very generously provided a total of $1.7 billion for our disaster victims. You have disaster victims in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Puerto Rico, and otherwise that are experiencing the same problems. But in my home state of Louisiana, you all generously provided us $1.7 billion in recovery. And the state has only offered less than $700 million to disaster victims. This money was appropriated 3 years ago. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I ask you to think about you sitting back in a gutted, moldy home because you can't get these grants because people were given a loan, or in some cases, just approved for a loan but not given one, and still deemed ineligible for a grant. So here's what I'm asking you for. In last year's appropriations bill, you all approved an amendment that we submitted that simply said that the SBA shall not collect payments on the loan from people that were deemed to be duplication of benefits victims. Meaning if you were deemed to be a victim of this duplication of benefits scenario, whereby you took out a loan, but then later were deemed ineligible for a grant, as long as these people were compatible with Section 1210 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that says that loans and grants aren't duplicative of one another, then it would simply prevent the SBA from collecting the loan payments. And so I just ask if you all please include that. It was obviously stripped out in conference because it was included in an unblock agreement last year. So I'd ask if we could include that in the base text, if we could try and fight for this in a conference committee. All we're doing, Mr. Chairman, is we are re-victimizing disaster victims all over again. And it's a result of bureaucrats and bureaucracy. I have had dozens and dozens of meetings. We've offered amendments all over the place trying to solve this problem, and it is ridiculous what we're doing to disaster victims. This problem has existed for decades, and we need to fix it once and for all. So ask for your support once again, and I want to thank you again for your help last year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my cousin, Mr. Graves, for his presentation. Very thoughtful, thorough explanation, and I know from your area and all of South Louisiana and all the areas you mentioned were impacted, what resiliency of constituency you have that have been through so much. You have a lot of knowledge about the SBA loans and grants and how they work, and I had a member yesterday ask me, would it be appropriate for us as a Congress to consider SBA loans in a similar fashion to businesses that are impacted by the coronavirus economic impact? Obviously, there's a lot of port areas. There's the West Coast, is impacted a lot by a lot of things not being shipped, by manufacturing being shut down in China and otherwise. What is your? I know I'm just throwing this at you, but do you have a thought about that? Because you've seen it from a disaster perspective, and I guess in some ways this is an economic disaster to a lot of businesses that are in essence being closed down now because they don't have the ability to import goods or supplies or raw materials to continue their businesses.
It's a great question. It's something that we absolutely need to think about. So, my thought is that when you have things that are outside people's control or a direct result of a government action. Now, look, we've all got to recognize there's risk in having a business and opening a business, and you've got to prepare for that. You've got to prepare for those ebbs and flows as you know things are gonna come at you. I think once things cross over a certain threshold, and I've actually talked about this in a disaster realm as well, maybe we ought to look at putting a certain threshold in and saying, look, states, if the disaster doesn't meet this threshold, it's yours, or we're going to cut you a check for this much and you deal with it. We're not going to deploy FEMA teams and everything else that end up adding more bureaucracy. I think when a federal government action or something beyond people's control crosses a certain threshold, we do it with Price Anderson, which is a program for nuclear power plants. We do it with TRIA for terrorism risk insurance. I think when things cross over a certain threshold and become sort of that catastrophic event, I do think that the federal government can play a role in stepping in and providing assistance, such as an SBA loan. We've obviously got to make sure that threshold is appropriately established. We do not need to step in every time something, some little event occurs. I think we've got to make sure that businesses are not being irresponsible with their dollars, meaning when things do change, you've got to make sure that your business is designed to be resilient through those changes in economy and other things and trends. But when you have something like this that crosses a pretty extraordinary cost threshold, I do think that the federal government should step in and provide some type of assistance. And I think that loan assistance, because keep in mind, they have to pay this back. I think that it is certainly the first step in assistance that we should provide, unless and until it crosses an extraordinary threshold.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, you know from this committee, and I've learned it so much, that SBA disaster assistance, loan assistance, all of these they're not handouts. They're in essence just a bridge that is required to be paid back with interest over time to businesses to assist them in transitioning through a difficult period of time. But no, thanks for your. Yeah.
Ranking member, you reminded me of something that I just find interesting. I don't know what the answer is. I don't want to pretend to be a finance guru, but on those SBA disaster loans, you actually get a higher interest rate the better your credit is. Say that again. The better your credit is, the higher your interest rate is, and it's interesting. I mean, it is. It's sort of a perverse incentive there. And I have spoken to the Small Business Committee about this a little bit, but I really think we ought to dig in a little deeper on that one and just be thoughtful there to make sure that we're allowing people to appropriately recover.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So are you still struggling with HUD on their guidance, or is that a bad?
So they've issued it, and I will tell you, it is completely flawed. And you may recall about 2 weeks.
There's no way back from this with them?
Well, I think there is, and I've met with everybody who will meet with me. HUD pretty much no longer takes my phone calls, but the deal is about 2 or 3 weeks ago, you may recall that Congressman Crenshaw and Congressman Fletcher offered an amendment on the House floor during an appropriations bill to try to at least partially address this for Texas as a result of some of the delays. But look. Disasters are inherently unpredictable, right? And so they're very difficult to deal with. There's no question about it. But this is our federal government, and I want to be clear. I'm not being political here. This started under Obama. It's continued now. This affects everybody. It does. Disasters don't discriminate.
The current HUD secretary is appearing tomorrow in front of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee. So if you want to put any of this in a request that we could sign on to, I'd be glad to pass it on. And
absolutely.
If you want to get that to us today, we'll be glad to forward it
Thank
tomorrow.
you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
Thank you for being here.
You bet.
Appreciate
Thanks.
that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
There appearing to be no further witnesses. We are adjourned. Thank you so much.